you might be wondering what is it I'm doing with these letters, because I'm currently working on a different book. And the answer to this question would be that I'm absolutely drawn to and attracted to the topic of diaspora studies, as Vasil was mentioning. But also I work...
Microphone.
How's that? Do I...
Там не чути ззаду.
Okay, so we will be doing the mic. Is it much better now, right? Probably. So I've spent some time pursuing the question of diaspora studies while working on yet another book. And this particular book is right now in my hands, and if you'd like to have a look at that, I will let it go into the world. And the topic of today's presentation is profiled in this book, as well as I've published on that particular topic some other times as well. So I'm going to just pass it around. Can I remove this?
Yeah.
This is very new for me. I don't like standing behind the podiums in a very still way, especially because I like to watch my own slides. Vasil has mentioned that I'm a cultural anthropologist, and that exactly what defines my approach when it comes down to studying the artifacts, which may have been otherwise of interest to scholars working in the field of history, maybe literary studies. And this is exactly an anthropological approach that informs my work on letters that had put me in the field together with people who've been writing back and forth, who've been exchanging letters with their relatives, be these experiences in Western Canada, in the United States, or also in Ukraine specifically. So what we will be talking today is the general discussion, which I happen to be introducing for the first time in the scholarship of Ukrainian studies, or Ukrainian diaspora studies, because we haven't had really much written on the topic of personal correspondence as exchanged between the people in diaspora and those in so-called homeland. So ultimately that's what we will be working on today with you. So, but before we will start, I have a question for everybody. When was the last time when you wrote a personal extended letter?
It's stand, okay, because the microphone or behind.
Pardon me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Нет, або там, або там.
So when was the first time, when was the last time, I'm sorry, when you engaged in writing an extended personal letter to someone?
Ні, Васа. Просто з мікрофоном не можна стояти.
Decades ago.
I wrote lots.
Pardon me?
We write a lot through the internet.
Yes, it's all on the
Email,
Right.
if you count that letter. And
Yes.
sometimes
Yes.
they are longer.
I wonder if you've registered some sort of a difference in how you engage with another person when you write or when you wrote that last letter versus when we do nowadays those emails or texts especially. We are in a world of technology which assists us to stay in touch with so many people. We simply don't need to do those letters anymore. But wouldn't it be a bit of a different experience? What do you think?
It is. Definitely, because it's history.
Right.
It's like photo also with the handwriting. And what's written there, it's already archived items.
That's right.
But we no longer consider it the old country. That is the
Yes,
difference.
that's why the quotation marks, yes. I do come from Canada. I've done my field work in the settings such as rural communities in Western Canada or urban communities in Western Canada. And interestingly enough, that trope of old country is still being used, especially in the smaller communities, especially outside of those institutional, organizational settings, in villages, in family networks, when people sit down to discuss their letters, which they've received from Ukraine or elsewhere, they resort back into that vocabulary because the vocabulary comes from the times when this kind of phenomenon, letter writing, was in place. So when it comes down to working and finally looking back at this short or long 20th century, depending how we define it, we know from personal experience that we've spent a lot of time here in the diaspora or back in those homeland communities writing letters to those who are overseas. And that's very much of a phenomenon of transatlantic letter writing between the families here in the diaspora, be it in New York or small rural community in Western Canada, with which I'm very familiar with that world, or be it a small community in Western Ukraine or Lviv or Kiev. In those very settings, these exchanges kept going and going, but we, meaning now scholars, haven't really reflected upon that silent, quiet phenomenon that accompanied our lives, organizational lives, institutional lives here in the diaspora, or back there in that so-called old country or homeland. So that intrigued me. As a scholar, as I've mentioned to you before, I work in the field. I like going amongst the people, and I've been inundated as a researcher with questions and requests to assist with translations, to help out one way or the other with these letters, to carry them, to smuggle them, and so on and so forth. I've done that before. And years of that experience had led me to question the idea of why that we haven't really worked on defining and understanding this phenomenon as it had continually evolved in the 20th century, a little bit beyond as well. Let me see if I can manage the technology now. So when you work as a scholar who wants to understand the phenomenon, especially if you wear this anthropological hat as I do, you begin questioning the process, the exchanges, the artifacts themselves with some sort of categorical lenses in mind. In order for us to start defining the letter writing between the two continents, or in our case, let's say North America and Ukraine, we understand that phenomena has been spanning around the world, of course. We will be looking back at certain time frames, and I will be using today references to Canadian context because that's where I've spent my time researching this phenomena more specifically. So what we will be briefly discussing today is a little bit of a timeline that we are going to be focusing on the topic of why these letters I refer to as vernacular letters, why they shall be called this way, or maybe why they are that way. And then, of course, I'll make some foray into attempting to define the phenomenon, again, wearing my anthropological lenses, by identifying some principal characteristics, by using, again, the love and scholarship using the word dad as samples. I understand them to be also somewhat questionable labels, but that's nonetheless what we're doing by using a sizable sample, which I worked on and assembled in my own archives back there. Ultimately, you can ask the question, why to bother with these letters, right? We know they exist, we know they've been exchanged back and forth between the communities, but this very question has been of interest to scholars of history, working on, of course, on topics of immigration, cultural adaptation, assimilation, translation, diaspora, homeland relations, and so on and so forth. So there are many reasons why letters are of interest, should be of interest to the researchers. And that has been the case elsewhere, but not in the context of Ukrainian studies, mainly. So we will also be looking, or one can also look at the question whether letters play any role in the life of Ukrainian Canadian community, or Ukrainian diasporic community for that matter. And of course they do, even if they're very private, even if they are part of our, non-institutional lives, so to speak. We don't really usually bring them into our professional engagements. And what are the meanings of those correspondences, right? So we will start with those questions. The interesting question which I have found out, or interesting observations I made when I started looking into the phenomenon of letter writing, is that transition from very public life, letters used to play in the lives of Ukrainian communities elsewhere outside of Ukraine, and versus very private lives, the letters have grown to lead sometime later in the 20th century. If you look back at the early period of immigration, say, of Ukrainians to Canada, we know, of course, that letters were those bloodlines which communicated and conveyed a lot of information, literally practical information on how to immigrate, who to contact, where to go. These letters were published prominently and used as a great illustrative material, appearing in newspapers, in journals, in periodicals. Moreover, the letters also played a public role by being read out loud in villages. Those people who couldn't write, who wanted to figure out how to pursue the immigration also would come to those who would receive those letters, and they will be read out loud. On top of it, knowing that that's the function of a letter, letters were written exactly with this understanding in mind. They were meant to be public documents. They were meant to be read out loud around the community or in the context of the extended family. In short, early on in the lives of the Ukrainian, in my case, Ukrainian-Canadian community, the letters played over very prominently in sort of on the surface of actually institutional, well, not so much institutional, but public life of communities, because they were playing an important role in that. That, in this particular slide, we see, I don't know how many of you have been familiar with the art of Yakov Majdanek, but you know, the Simpsons of the day would have been presented with the help of cartoons, various cartoon characters, and here you have that very charismatic immigrant character who really hadn't learned how to speak proper English, speaks in a very strange language, if you can read it a little bit, because it's a complete macaronic language, as Professor Bogdan-Khmelnytsky refers to it, and who is used by Yakov Majdanek as this gluing, as the model, as the character to entertain, of course, the community themselves, but also as point out to the community who people who've been reading and admiring and consuming his art, all the values and vials and failures and successes of the immigration so far. So he's been a very charismatic character. So even that Shtiv Tabachnik, Vuyko Shtiv Tabachnik, was engaged in letter writing in order to send letters back to his family. So here is one of those letters profiled in the calendar. I think it's 1918. But years went by, and those who have written those original letters, those immigrants themselves, have moved on, right, in lives. They've settled down, they've bought their farms, they've gotten their better jobs, they've married, they've brought up kids, they have, bought cars, built houses, started raising their grandchildren, and so on and so forth. So in other words, times have moved on, and the connection between the old country family and the new country family had been redefined. And with this, of course, we know, like it is in New York or elsewhere, community organizations, community developments have taken on as well. Our interest in diaspora has transitioned and shifted from away, maybe from the original networks of families which were left behind. Once we were brothers to those who we've left there, or maybe children to those who we've left behind. But by now, by the 50s, 60s, we are parents and grandparents, and we have different roles in life. So that sort of personal correspondence have moved into background, and it had become quietly, as I mentioned before, it's kind of started accompanying our lives in a very quiet way, very important way nonetheless, because if you think about how you engage in letter writing, and we were just talking about that, how much of a different experience it is. It serves so many purposes, and I don't have time to elaborate on that, of course, and you can help me later to do that. But with this transition, the letters themselves were, as I mentioned, they moved away from the public gaze. They stopped being published in newspapers. And it's interesting enough, when I was talking to Natалія Ханенко-Фрізен, who is probably well known in New York as well. She was born and raised here. And she's now considered, a Canadian Ukrainian artist or Ukrainian American artist living in Canada. So when Natалія Ханенко-Фрізен in 1977 turns her attention to letters, and when she begins using the letter as an object and a subject in her art, then to me, knowing Natалія Ханенко-Фрізен's art, she only engages in trivia to make it more fun and sexy again. So for that particular art, to me, was a proof that letters have completely gone from the domain of public life, or Ukrainian Canadians or Ukrainian Americans. And of course, I'm not even focusing in my conversation today on how and what it was like for the Ukrainians in Ukraine to continue to engage in correspondence. We can talk about that later. So letters' lives have moved on and have become very, very private. And that's why Natálka was interested in this particular art. I mean, in a particular form of a letter. So looking back at this sort of a transition from public life to private life of a letter, one, like myself, was interested, okay, how interesting to see that transition happening, but let's go back into scholarship and see what's been done. And when I was digging into that particular question, I've discovered little was done. So no one really had researched personal letters in the context of Ukrainian diasporic research. Be it Ukrainian Canadian, Ukrainian American. Some scholars have certainly focused on letter. Of interest to me specifically is the work of Robert Bogdan Klimash, a renowned folklore scholar in Canada who, again, using his categorical lenses of a folklore scholar, approached the letter writing differently than, say, someone who would be just coming from history, using them as a sources of information for the study of, labor migration and so on and so forth. Klimash was interested in the formula, and utilization of letters exactly in these traditional folk settings. So that was of interest to me. But so far we have seen really little written on the topic of the immigrant, so-called immigrant letters, or diaspora homeland letters, as I choose to refer to them. Then a few more citations here given. There, of course, recently we've seen maybe one or two more articles focusing on the topic, but usually, as has been done in history, scholars, are focusing on the specific correspondence, the specific collections, and it's, of course, great and wonderful. You also can see that some research actually has been done in the United States, in the University of Minnesota, as a part of the bigger archival collection. That little scholarship is puzzling, especially if we look back and contextualize this scholarly work in the field of immigrant letter research. Because when you step outside of the Ukrainian scholarly context and you begin exploring others' work done in the field, you recognize, or one recognizes, a lot has been done, and also has been happening for a very long period of time. One of the fundamental collections which had we can say, triggered that whole field of academic research, the immigrant letter research, has been published originally in 1918, 1920, and it's actually quite related to the topic of ours. If we speak of Ukrainian letter writing, because it focuses on Polish experiences and on Polish letters. You can see, and it's just a small segment of what is going on in the field of letter research outside of Ukrainian studies. So a lot has been done on Swedes, on Dutch, on Italians, and British and Germans, on Estonians, and so many other, well, at least European cultures, not something, but other European cultures who generated influx of people coming to the, say, United States or Canada for settlement a long time ago, and many more others. The scholarly debate on letters also is quite fascinating because, like myself, my predecessors were also wondering why to bother with those letters. Letters are very challenging to research. First of all, where do you find them to research if they're not in the archives, like it is the case with Ukrainian letters? We don't really have many archives which are focusing specifically on studying, documenting, and preserving personal letters. Of course, archives have collections, and they have profiled and included correspondences of some famous individuals or letters which were sent to famous individuals. We have those. They're established community leaders and so on and so forth. Archives actually would be a great place to go, but ultimately that's somewhat of a different story because these individuals have played important institutional roles, and that's why we have those collections. What about the rest of many of people out there? I want to say the rest of us, but then I stopped for a second because many of us are involved with the institutional lives of our communities, obviously, especially because we're attending Shevchenko Foundation presentations. So that is a very good question to ask, why to bother? Their answers were, of course, conflicted and not confusing, but conflicted, or not conflicted, but complex, I would say. Importantly, of course, and traditionally letters were used like any other written documentation which can illustrate historical processes one studies and explores. That is great, that's good to know and good to explore those letters. But when you want to kind of go and follow up on that trail, you realize that usually letters are usually not preserved as two-way correspondences. We only have access to these collections as one-way correspondences. They're stored in archives because they were saved, like in those boxes in the first picture, by people like us and my own family as well. And they're ending up in the archives as such. The letters are challenging sources because they are not true to the specifics. No, very rarely letters are letter writers bother to describe facts precisely, to point out the, or to speak in a very precise, very sort of a concise way about important phenomena or historical developments which are happening. Oftentimes personal letters, family letters, which I'm interested in, are focusing on family. So how can we then reconcile the plane of family history, that quotidian lives, or sort of quiet lives of everyday people, with the catastrophic and cataclysmic 20th century processes, which of course we know Ukraine was very much steeped and involved in or affected by. So we are also recognizing when you work with the letter as a source, you're presented with so many more challenges to truly justify them as sources of the research. So I've pulled out one of those letters, and I don't know whether you can, I tried to make it readable. I wonder if anybody recognizes the language. I would use the word language. As an anthropologist, we don't like the word dialect. Everything is language. It's all about power relations. Nonetheless, so we have this particular rendition, which comes from a village in western Ukraine, and is a combination of Slovak, Polish, Ukrainian, both drama and language, and yet also the letter writing itself is very tricky because it has at some points cyrillics and other points it's not, so it's completely very hard to read. So sometimes it's just hard to read, period. As I mentioned, it's very hard to access two-way correspondence, to understand maybe the family dynamic, if that's what we're using it. Letters are highly of subjective nature, linguistic challenges, and a political context, coming back to that very dimension of Ukrainians' lives back in Ukraine. Of course, we all remember, many of you have lived through that censorship, which Ukrainians in Ukraine and also Ukrainians in diaspora have been experiencing when it came down to exchanging letters. So all of that is very much complicating the information which may be included in the letter, and we will later see one of those correspondences, how oftentimes information just coded to be sent, to be able to pass it on from one Soviet Ukraine, which was very much officials were very much against the correspondence with the West and those who are of diaspora. So of course censorship had dictated its own narrative norms and foci and topics which can be included in the letter, which cannot be. And then ethical considerations. I've been working with the letters for a long period of time. Some of them are fully released in terms of consent form, and we can use the names as I am able to now to do in these presentations. Other letters are passed on to us with an understanding and no consent to be released to public readers. So we have to respect that. And in so many cases, I'm picking up a correspondence which has happened to be placed in our archives. No one really cared about this correspondence, but I'm reading the letters and I understand to honor that person who wrote it, I can't make it public, I can't use it in the archive because of what is being written. All these challenges are, of course, in a way. Nonetheless, so some 10 years ago, so I've started working on this idea of how can we define the phenomenal letter writing in the context of Ukrainian diaspora interactions. And I started collecting the correspondences. As of now, in Prairie Center, where I'm based, it's in Western Canada, in Saskatchewan, University of Saskatchewan. I've started the personal sources archives and started documenting those collections. And together with my research assistants, when we have chance, money mostly, we have the ability to produce some statistical representation of these collections. So a couple of years ago, we pulled this up very complicated chart, but you can see what we have in our archives. It gets redistributed by years slightly for that period of time. When I ask you the question, when was the last time you wrote a real letter, probably explains why that is dwindling. I'm not suggesting that we don't communicate with Ukraine. Of course we do. In fact, we can say with the two-way traffic, two-way communication in general has increased dramatically since the 1990s. with Ukraine's independence, perestroika and independence, and so on and so forth. But the physical letters, packaged as such, written as such, have been exiting the circles of, cultural circles of late modernity, whatever you want to define the end of the 20th century. We physically were watching the end of it. So the major collections we have, there are 5 major collections I'm profiling here, are distributed as such. We don't really have very old letters, unfortunately, in our collection. They do exist in other archives, but that goes back into these times. But of course, the 60s and up are mostly what we currently have. And of course, many, and some other letters as well. As I mentioned to you before, I'm using those anthropological lenses when it comes down to defining and looking at the letters which are exchanged back and forth. And I'm therefore offering this analysis exclusively on the terms of anthropological terms. Someone else might come up with a different interpretation. For example, I've referred back to that immense, extended scholarship which focuses on the research of immigrant letter in different cultural contexts. And it's been very typical and characteristic of my colleagues working on Dutch, Swedish correspondences, German, Belgian correspondences, and so on and so forth, to focus on individual letter writers. There's something about letters which have been coming from the former USSR versus some letters which were coming from elsewhere to North America. There's some interesting there's some interesting difference in how these are crafted, produced, and what they in the end they offer as someone like me as a reader. Again, we don't have time to discuss that, but I have to bring it up. The Soviet system again in this particular case. We also understand that letters, personal letters, oftentimes written in a very traditional way. There are local conventions how to talk, how to exchange greetings to people. There are also, and have always been, local conventions how to write. Obviously, traditional Ukrainian culture mostly is defined, but it's steeped in the oral tradition. And interestingly enough, that oral tradition has found its way into our written letters, especially if they're coming from our smaller rural communities in Ukraine. And if you have a chance to work with so many as I did, you sense this rhythm, you understand that sort of folkloric nature of it. They're very much written by, in accordance to local conventions. It doesn't mean that people who wrote those were uneducated or undereducated or were not, community activists or political activists. No, it's the conventions, it's like, we always feel we need to fit into some sort of existing molds, right? So that's the example of it. Correspondences in the context of my research, what I found out also very interesting, I'll talk about it a bit later in specific terms, ended up being multi-generational. And that differs, my analysis, from the analysis of other scholars when it comes down to immigrant correspondence. As I mentioned, normally scholars focus on the fact that letters are written and composed and exchanged between individuals. And that's, we're drawn to those letters oftentimes, especially if they're well elaborated and well, extended letters. Correspondence lasted because of several generations. This kind of goes by default. It takes a lot of time. It's unfolded through an extended period of time. And this one again intrigued me because if you look at that fact that letters kept coming back and forth, being sent from here to Ukraine or other homelands, which could be elsewhere, as we know, outside of Ukraine proper, in political terms, or letters coming from those Ukrainian homelands back to North America, they have grown to be a phenomenon, a tradition of its own, with formalized language, patterns of exchange, formulae, greeting formulas, with what goes into letter, what doesn't go into letter. There are traditions, there are parameters of this tradition. So we are talking about actually a unique cultural phenomenon with its own parameters. Interestingly enough, because I was again interested in this sort of a multi-generational sustenance of letter writing, I also have begun to discuss, I went to discuss the fact that they can be perhaps characterized by different modes of what would be initial correspondence lives, then the habitual correspondence life, and then the revival correspondence life. Let's just see one particular collection
of letters I want to speak about today is the one which we received early on in our archives by the so-called family of the Vakarchuk's letters. We have about 122 letters, 122 letters in our collection. Letters were written in our collection. They're dated by these particular years. And they've covered at least 3 settings. You can see one is in Romania, one is in Chernivtsi Oblast, the village of the Venets, and one is in Yorkton, which is the very Ukrainian small Western Canadian community in Saskatchewan. Also, there are a couple more in the same neighborhood. But ultimately, this particular correspondence, let me see what this. This particular correspondence is very interesting and very moving as well, because Vasil, I'm just going to move to the letter so you can read a little bit from this letter. Vasil, the oldest brother of 4 siblings, goes to Canada in 1913. Again, like many others, right? So he arrives to Ontario, he settles down, but he works in the mine, trying to figure out what to do with himself next. Eventually, 2 years later, he moves to Saskatchewan, manages to work there for a couple of years as a hired hand on farms. A couple of more years, 1924, he buys his land, marries, it's just time has come, settles down finally. And meanwhile, he is quietly writing back and forth letters, exchanging letters with his family. In our collection, our early letters are those written by his mother to him, because our collection contains only letters which arrived from Ukraine and which were kept by Vasil at the end of his life, and eventually they ended up being in our archives. Vasil has left in 1913, and we can speculate, and I know from the interviews with his family, that his parents and 3 more siblings in Ukraine has been left behind, or they were anyhow left behind, but and we understand why 1914 was next year to roll into people's lives and that wreak havoc in so many lives, so many individuals throughout the rest of the century. Then, in short, his family stayed behind. He's the only person here in North America. He wrote letters with a few more members, but then eventually his youngest brother, who was only 2 years of age when he's left Ukraine, he started corresponding with this particular individual, with this particular brother. And that correspondence lasted for some 50 years, and this is amazing. You have 50 years of person's life sitting in this particular box, and then you start opening up these letters, and you step inside of those times, and you read those letters, and you're in the zone, which is very different, of course, than what we see usually outside of the window. So very moving correspondence, very much has been said. But what I wanted to, of course, so much can be pointed out to do. For example, this particular letter, which is from the 60s, is crafted in a very unique way. I've tried to preserve it in some different colors. So first you have their formula, greeting formula. This one is repeated from letter to letter. You can open up practically every letter of his. That will be the formula, how he writes his greetings. Then you have those unique local ways of addressing older brothers. His youngest brother writes to the oldest brother, Badika and Lilika. That's his wife, Canadian wife now. In this particular 60s time, we have Vasil is very established community activist, very well respected guy, built many communities, supported Catholic churches and so on and so forth. Got children, got grandchildren, very rooted, has his own kinship network, right, so to speak. So that being incorporated in letter as well. But then, of course, he reports oftentimes about the parcels which were sent twice a year, or for most time once a year, but very regularly, as of course you can imagine, maybe you remember doing it yourself. They were absolutely welcome parcels because they sustained lives of many families, and there's a lot of interesting stories about Hustkas we can talk about later on if you would have an interest to ask about that. But then he goes on to describe his own local life, and you see he uses the words, the phrase district priests, which have nothing to do with reality, what was going on, and how life has not been easy, because he basically literally refers in a very convoluted, in a very hidden way, refers to the fact how the Soviet rule had ruined his family life, what has become of the village, and that goes on in several more letters. So he hides so much behind, again, formulas. And one really needs to read many letters, and one, of course, needs to know history of Ukraine to understand what is going on. So how to use these letters for research? So because of these complexities, or other features, that these kinds of letters are informative in a very unique way, in their own unique way. Let's see what is going on with this particular. As I've mentioned, this particular correspondence has lasted for between the two brothers for about 50 years. One has never, they've never met each other until 1974, when Vasil, the Canadian brother, had the chance to hop on the Interest tour and go to Ukraine, because finally, suddenly, these organized tourism expeditions were allowed, in which you first go to Moscow, check out the Vedenka, then you go to capitals, then you go on the cruise, and you go maybe, also many of the diaspora Ukrainians wanted to go and meant to go. First and above all, they wanted to go to their home villages. That wasn't allowed. Again, you probably remember those times. And there were, in this particular book, which I probably circulate somewhere, I hope, there are stories about these homecoming trips in which you go on. So anyhow, on one of those tours, very quietly, clandestinely, he goes to the village of his brother. They meet for a very short period of time, and then they go back into the relationship, what I call the lettered relationship of their own, and which, of course, they've interestingly, after that short meeting, which was very short, I was, a little bit surprised to recognize that their correspondence hasn't changed. It remained to be as ritualistic, as formulaic as it had been before. And I've been puzzled by that, and I'm discussing why that has been the case in this particular book later on as well. And it's, a complex enough situation, of course. And this ritualized, habitual practice has been punctuating both gentlemen's lives throughout those periods of times. And only after the death of those primary writers, Vasil and Stefan, that the correspondence rekindled in the 80s. Because finally, Vasil's children have gone into the attic, found the letters, and scratched their heads. That's what was going on with our dad for the entire lives of ours with him. He's never, ever told his family that he's been writing letters back and forth. How they managed that, I don't know. Blame children's ignorance, maybe, because obviously letters were coming to a certain address. Maybe, I don't have access to Vasil or to that information anymore. But the fact is that the daughter of Vasil contacts our research center, brings this correspondence, tells me, we found that, what are we doing with this now? And they've already done the project of the family history, so it's kind of too late to use it for the family history book, because Canadians have celebrated the 100th anniversary of settlement a long time ago, and 120 pieces gone. Anyhow, these letters are stopped being exchanged between the brothers, but then eventually the children, Vasil's children, stepped in and started exchanging letters with the family which was left in Ukraine. And it's a completely new game when it comes down to corresponding. But yet it still is part of that, multi-generational, I call it kinship-based correspondence. We also have a word corporate letter writing, using to describe that. And the very last couple of letters which these two gentlemen exchanged, their new age was bringing them closer to some sort of a closure, and came down to their lettered relationship. As I said, very moving. Both of them are quite, just farmers, but very sensitive in how they wrote to each other. In a concise way, but nonetheless. And he has, his last words, and then he says this absolutely uncharacteristic of him, sort of poetic way of putting things together. Until our next sweet meeting, even if only in these letters, please respond, your brother Stefan, so the one who was writing. So he, in some ways, this particular line helped me to answer a couple of other questions, whether we, usually when we look at letters, we usually understand them. Of course, they're bridging the two worlds together. There are the connections, there are bloodlines between the families there and the families here. But is it really the case? How do exactly the bridging is taking place and happening? So the correspondence of these two gentlemen, and especially that particular last punchline, sorry for this, it's so disrespect, not punchline, but this particular including line, as I meant to say, had really stuck with me and struck me as an answer to that question, how do the letters that they bring people together, how do they bridge the individual? So, and that's ultimately what I was interested in figuring out in the book as well. And if one can contemplate a little bit, and I'll just try to consider that particular question. When it comes to this idea of a bridge, we understand we are here to talk about some connection between the world A and the world B, which are separated by distances, huge distances. There's more than one distance, though, to talk about. The distance, one and very obvious, is the one of time, is one of space. One family is in Ukraine, the other one is across Atlantics, in North America, wherever they are. Spread probably, because how we are these days, across the continents or maybe the globe. This is one obvious distance which needs to be overcome, but there's another distance which I acknowledge exists and affects the writers and writing profoundly. I call it the distance in identities. I think I've referred to that already when I was pointing out how our kinship roles bifurcate with time, how going through time we are not just simply continuing to be daughters and children of our parents, but we also become spouses, then parents, then grandparents, uncles, aunts, and so on and so forth. How that all is affecting our identities altogether. And I'm talking about those private identities. I'm not talking about political and so on and so forth. That's the domain which I'm interested in. So this bifurcation of kinship identities affects how we write. And again, if you are engaged in these kind of letter exchanges, and I do cite some interesting ethnographic, some stories people shared with me, what a chore it was to write those letters, whether you were in Canada or in Ukraine, trying to maintain that bridge. It was very difficult. Because you have to enter the space of correspondence by undoing who you are. You have to stay on and perform certain identity, which is a lettered identity. That lettered world of yours is very different than your real world. And then eventually, of course, with time going by, letters, because they are, family undertakings in the context of Ukrainians, in the diaspora, and Ukrainians in Ukraine, in my context, Ukrainian Canadians, we're talking about genealogical distances, which also are to be reconciled with. Because initial correspondence early on in the 20th century, when the mass migration began to happen, were immediate relatives of each other. And those people who are now communicating with old established folks in the diaspora usually are twice, 3 times removed cousins and nephews and whatnot, right? There's a lot of genealogical reconstruction going on to sometimes explain what is going on with the relationships there. So this is kind of a third distance. But then ultimately, if you read these letters, and maybe if you remember writing them or reading your family letters, there's also an understanding, at least I've come to an understanding with thanks to the words by the brothers exchanging their letters back there, that letters ultimately present us with this sort of a third space. And I go on to discuss it in some academic terms, the liminal space as such, as the mythical space, which exists really outside of our normal, regular, engaged, very busy lives. Children commits to school, parents to call, community events to organize. Bomb letter comes from Ukraine. Oh, parcel, I have to send it up. And the other way around, right? Children are running to be sent to school, fields to be plowed, whatnot. Bomb letter comes from Canada. Oh, I need to write and thank them again. So what are we doing and how are we doing? We're entering these spaces of letters by their different worlds. They're not even the worlds, they're not even representations of real worlds back there. Because what goes on in letter in terms of sort of constructed reality in which you and someone else is participating in is a constructed reality, is the third one. I also go on to discuss the difference between this sort of a mythical horizon of personal letter writing as it exists in our private lives, in comparison to how other myths are functioning in our society. There are huge differences, of course. The myths, the stories, the Hollywood movies, which also formulated and based on fairy tales we once upon a time read as children, now watch on TV, they are serving such different purposes. They're publicly accessible. We partake in them as communities at large, and we share those myths. But letters and their universes are so private. We don't share, like Vasil and his family. They're very privately lived, these spaces. Again, very challenging spaces to live through. So how to, again, reconcile those huge distances is the good question whether the letter does it or not. And so this is ultimately those questions which I have been turning on to discuss in my research here and there. So when it comes down, it's probably our last slide, when it comes down to this, very big question of trying to define the phenomenon of diaspora homeland letter writing. As I'm a scholar, I'm interested in anthropologist, I'm interested in seeing people's practices, and I'm recognizing them unfolding over the long period of time. Therefore, I'm interested in it as a phenomenon. So this is the challenge to define it. For me, it has been for sure. And obviously, we can refer back to this idea the letters written between the families are personal undertakings, and they've been done in unique enough settings, especially if we'll take into consideration this original immigration, because it's a bit different here for the, for folks in New York, for Toronto-based Ukrainian Canadian immigration, but the Western Canada, where I'm beginning my conversation about, is characterized by that. There are letters exchanged between the villages in one world and the villages in a different world, where they've resettled. So they come with traditions and vernacular and oral formulaic principles. Letter writing, of course, needs to be considered as a phenomenon on its own terms if we want to refer back to this very big question why to bother with those letters. They may be challenging sources for us to go and explain historical phenomena in one unique context or the other, but they are a historical phenomena on their own terms, the letters. We don't recognize them as such because we've been part of those processes and circulation networks. But it is a phenomenon of its own. So it has its own lifespan, structure, internal dynamics, form, content, public and private dimensions, role, and of course historical context. And Ukrainian correspondence as such is especially unique because of where letters were coming from, the totalitarian state of the former Soviet USSR. Letter writing is driven by both, and that's where I'm coming in as a scholar with novel approach to letter study. Something, from my understanding, hasn't been done yet. So letter writing as such is driven by both individual and corporate agency. What do I mean by that? Sure, of course, individual agency, understandably, I'm the one to participate in, to write the letters. I feel responsible for that sort of continue, letters writing to continue. There's that. But what about that idea of corporate agency? What does that mean? Literally, because of our bifurcated identities, kingship-wise, later on in lives, and how responsible we are with respect to families, be they here or there, we are also seeing that sort of responsibility continues on through the generation. When the initial correspondence ends, the habitual phase of it begins when letters may stop being very informative and become to be very ritualistic. Greetings for Christmas, greetings for Easter, parcel here, thank you letter there, maybe embroidery on the way back. So this is a very rhythmic, calendric cycle is here, and so on and so forth. Very, very important part of many people's lives, of course. So, but that continues on after the initial writers move on in lives or pass on, so to speak, and the next generations come in. Usually, one can speculate who is puts more initiative here, those in Ukraine or those in diaspora. Both, of course, for different reasons, and for the same reasons, for the sake of restoring the sense of genealogical continuity. Totally different to get topical together, but nonetheless. So that's why I see the letters as an outcome of that sort of corporate agencies. When I cite my colleague in Ternopil, Igor Dichuk, probably some people might even know him, when he sits down and tells me a story, what a chore it was for his father to write a letter to his family in Ukraine, and how his wife would be standing and telling him, thank him for the parcel. But the parcel I've thanked for already in 2 letters before. Thank him again for the parcel. But what am I writing? What am I writing this letter? Wife, and the family tells you have to write that. So here we have this concept of agency, right? The person just like it's difficult for me to write because I haven't seen the guy for 50 years. I'm not sure who he is and how he's treating my letters, of course. But it's an important thing to do, and that's this idea of corporate agency. This phenomenon also is best understood as seen as exchange not between individual family members, but between kinship groups as such. And ultimately, when it comes down to what it means and what kind of roles it played in our lives, letters, I see them, at least myself, and as a scholar, I understand that being very much a good fit with how anthropologists see many other cultural processes being ritualized and being third spaces and what. So the letters ultimately become the third space into which writers have would go to continue on to work on those letters. This would be the end of my talk, and thank you very much for your attention.